Welcome back to another special edition of the Daily Wrestling News Show, where we are on a mission to teach, learn, and remember the history of professional wrestling with everyone that wants to join us. My name is Ryan Joy, and I am here today with John DeConnie as we talk about episode number 4 of Tales from the Territory in this special Daily Wrestling News Show episode. John, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Good morning, sir. Not bad. How about yourself?
Very good. What'd you think of championship wrestling from Florida?
It got maybe not as good as episode 1 from Memphis, but it got back to last week was a little, I don't want to say weak, but there were less stories there. It was a lot more just crap, like frat boy crap.
Yeah.
Sometimes literally, unfortunately. And last night I think was back to more of what we wanted, like the crazy stories and whatnot. And it was, and definitely it was some stuff that I was definitely learning once again, because I knew Florida was a big territory. There was certain people who were there that I didn't realize kind of got their start there, and certain things that happened there that I didn't realize. Oh, that's where that happened. Okay, so yeah, there was a lot to learn.
I give them a lot of credit every week when they don't ever even really use it that much throughout the show, but when I search out what their little subtitle is for the episode,
yes,
they're always really great. This week was Bloodstains in the Everglades. That's just freaking awesome. Funny though, they didn't really talk about any wrestling. If you know the geography of Florida, I don't think they really talked about anything specifically that happened in South Florida. They were mostly talking about stories from Tampa, and they did some story from Melbourne, which is actually it's probably 45 minutes to an hour north of where I am. So, and of course the story that from Melbourne to Tampa, which I'm sure we'll talk about. The people telling stories this week: Steve Kern, Gerald Briscoe, Bob Roop, Kevin Sullivan, and Brian Blair. Steve Kern, if you don't recognize that name, you might recognize Skinner from WWE. That's his real name. And Brian Blair. That's funny. We had Jim Brunzell last week, and we have Brian Blair this week. So now we have the full set of Killer Bees.
Yeah, and to think they had to go from Minnesota to Florida to get together and wind up in New York.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. So, which story do you think stood out the most to you on this show?
By far and away, it was the one that they kind of got into right off the bat. Steve Kern's the whole pulling the reality of Steve Kern's father in to a storyline on television, and in fact, some of the stories that they told last night were, oh yeah, and hey, that was just for a house show, like,
right.
I think the thing that hits me the most about these 4 episodes so far was that these guys weren't getting paid terribly well.
Mm-hmm.
And the dedication they have to this ironclad kayfabe that they're willing to hurt people to keep it going. And the fact that the fans are so invested that, there's dozens, if not hundreds of stories of guys getting, stabbed or punched or attacked or rocks thrown at them and whatnot. To hit a chord like this, to make fun of a 2-time POW man who fought in, and I had to look up some dates because the math just wasn't adding up for me.
Oh, good, because I don't have them. So go through that. Yeah.
Steve Kern's father was part of the Bloody 100 bomber group in World War II. Which, when I think of World War II, I think of my grandfather. I think of obviously the 1940s. World War II ends 1945, and in Kern's case, he was liberated by the Soviets in I think he was in Poland, where he was a POW. The Vietnam War starts in 55, but the U.S. doesn't get involved till 65.
Wow.
So if he was 18 years old in World War II, he's pushing 40 in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
there are not a lot of 40-year-old soldiers, but
Sure.
he is once again shot down, and he becomes a POW, spends 8 years in a camp there, and that is just crazy and insane. And the fact once he was freed, that was wonderful, and he came home to his son, who had put on 80 pounds of rip and was a different human being that he almost didn't even recognize. But the fact that they decided to take that story to the ring. Now, they did it with Steve Keirn's father's blessing because he wanted to do anything to help his son succeed. But knowing how hardcore wrestling fans were back then,
Yeah.
and you weren't doing this for millions of dollars, so you didn't have private security walking around with you to keep you, safe. I mean, they were taking their lives in their hands for what wound up being one of the most memorable storylines in that territory's history, maybe one of the most memorable storylines in wrestling history, but they got 2 months out of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And on multiple occasions, Bob Roop, former soldier himself, All-American college wrestler, Olympic athlete, playing the part of the bad guy, saying that POWs are a disgrace for being captured. There were multiple times where he could have been killed for his part in this storyline, and they got 2 months of play out of it.
He did give him an out. He said anybody that's captured twice is a coward. And what's interesting about this is, they put Eddie Graham up on a pedestal throughout this whole thing. Talking about how great he was for the business and how great he was for the community and everything. And Eddie also kind of took Steve Keirn in because he was in the ninth grade when his dad was captured, and he was like 21 or something like that when he was released. So Eddie Graham was somewhat of a father figure, and it turned out that Steve Keirn's first match was the day that his father was released or landed back in the United States or whatever. So,
Crazy.
that kind of incredible.
Mm.
Now, this storyline that we're talking about was Steve Keirn's idea, and Eddie Graham, they said on multiple accounts, would not have signed off on this. It was too serious. He wouldn't do it. But to their benefit, I guess, Eddie was in Australia trying to buy that territory, and he was over there for 3 or 4 months. So Jody Hamilton was the booker, and he was fine with it, I guess. So, so they do this angle, and to your point, Keirn brings it to Bob Roop. Bob Roop says he was grateful when Keirn brought it to him because it's like once in a lifetime that you get something so hot. And he knew this would be hot. And because Steve Keirn's dad, actually, there was national press about this release. And so he knew that it would get really, really hot. And then afterwards, when he looks back at it in retrospective, he's also really grateful for doing the angle because it raised their level as performers, both Keirn and Bob Roop through that period. So, yeah, that was an incredible story, I thought.
Unbelievable. I mean, just the fact that, again, we've heard just last week, we heard the story of a fan legitimately firing a loaded weapon at Bobby Heenan.
Yes.
And Roop at one point is confronted in a parking lot by a soldier. And he realizes, all right, well, I'm too far away from me. He's got the gun pointed at me, like he's ready to go. All he's got to do is flinch his finger, and he's firing this gun at me. So I'm not close enough to him to attack him. I've got no cover. I can't run away from him. What the hell am I going to do here? And he basically counts on this person being military, being too honorable to shoot him in the back. So he just turns his back to the man and starts to walk away.
Yes.
And somehow he left that parking lot alive.
It reminded me of the first episode of Tales from the Territory with the Iron Sheik thing and Jimmy Hart, where Iron Sheik was like, basically the helicopter had gone down, and Sheik and Jimmy Hart do their whole promo and everything, and then the Sheik gets death threats. This was like not uncommon during this time period. So,
and with all the stories we have of unfortunate wrestler passings and horrible things that went on. The fact that we haven't just had more wrestlers flat out murdered is almost shocking.
Right. Right. And the ones that were, to my knowledge, I've not really heard anybody murdered because of the business.
No,
Dino
no.
Bravo murdered
Yeah.
for outside issues, but not, nothing like most untimely deaths are due to drug use or
Stuff and
suicide.
Hogan.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's crazy. The other theme throughout all these territories is this whole concept of protecting the business and what they do when they encounter tough guys. And uh, this one was good. I kind of have heard some of these stories before about some of these tough guys, and they would come in and they would bring them in and they would stretch them. And but the part that was an addition to those stories, I'll say, is the one where Roop has the guy and he stretched him in the ring. The guy rolls out and he runs for the doors. Well, Eddie Graham has chained the doors shut, so the guy can't get out, and he turns around to see Eddie Graham coming at him, and the guy says, "Oh God, no, I'm done." And Eddie says, "I'm not God, mother." You can fill in the blank. I'm Eddie Graham. And he proceeds to punch him and beat him down. And Bob Roop would say the reason that they gave people that beating is because if you just stretch them, they can go into the bar or whatever and they can still say that it's fake.
Yeah.
You needed to leave a mark on them so that so that the people knew
Yeah.
it wasn't fake.
Broken wrist, dislocated ankle. Yes, it's something where there was a red flag when you were walking down the street that you may be a tough guy, but the wrestlers were tougher and they literally left their mark on you, and
Yes.
just
And
unbelievable
it's
way.
and in this territory, it seemed like not only was this something they did for tough guys or whatever that were running their mouth, but also something they like to do to people who just thought they could get into the business, like Hulk Hogan. And we've heard this story a bunch of times. Hogan's told it a bunch of times where Matsuda grabs his ankle and twists it. But Jerry Briscoe provided a few more details. Matsuda's got Hogan in the ring, day one, and he just twists Hulk's ankle until they hear a big pop. Hogan rolls out, pulls his tennis shoe off, and the Briscoes see that it's already black and blue and it's swelling up to the size of a basketball. They send the future Hulk Hogan on his way, and miraculously nothing was broken. So Hogan calls back, and he wants to come back, and they said, you know, let's maybe give it a couple of days. And to Hogan's credit, he called every day, and he was back in the ring within a week. And they thought, well, they really have something with this guy. So fascinating, really.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder how fast he. It was a week before he was back in the ring. I wonder how fast he was back on stage with that bass, just slapping the bass. 'Cause
Right.
that's what young Terry was doing at that time, in between getting stretched by Eddie and friends.
And the way he was discovered is the Briscoes saw him in the third row week after week because he was just really into it. And so Jerry kind of uh, makes a joke at himself that he's kind of like a groupie for Hulk Hogan or whatever. But uh, they seek him out and they go to the bar where he's playing, and they talk to the waitress and they're like, "Oh yeah, he's a big fan. I'm sure he'd love to meet with you." So she brings the Briscoes sort of backstage, and they meet Hulk Hogan back there, and that's kind of how Hogan gets in the business. So
Yeah, and
okay.
it's crazy that he's a mega fan. Like
Yeah,
he stands out just because he's 6'7" or whatever he is, and built like a Greek god. But he's at the time I think they said he was he was a good baseball player in his youth.
and
But other than
bowler
that, he really wasn't. What's that?
and bowler too.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
was
it's
good at
bowler.
bowling,
You gotta include all the important sports.
right?
Uh, yeah, but he's other outside of that, he's really not much of an athlete. And here's just a guy, he's just a kid playing in a rock and roll band, and he's a super fan of wrestling. And because he's got the physique for it, I mean, like, just think about it. Between that story last night about them trying to send him home, and this actually, of course, this comes up in the episode. I think Kevin Sullivan brought it up, and we had talked about Flair and his plane crash. What if Hulk Hogan didn't? Terry Bollea didn't come back to get stretched again,
Yeah.
or what if Ric Flair was hurt worse in that plane crash? What would the wrestling landscape look like? Because those are two crazy happenstances that really could have changed the face of wrestling completely. It could still be a territory, local gyms kind of regional thing.
Yeah. Without those two figures, so it's bad enough to think, well, what if we didn't have one of them?
Right,
Imagine if we didn't have both.
right,
If
right.
if we didn't have so if we didn't have Hogan, I think Vince McMahon would have made a much more serious play at trying to get Flair and Harley
Sure.
Race and those guys earlier on. And he would have pushed somebody into that spot.
Yeah.
But if you didn't have Flair too, if you didn't have either one, man, the territories and the whole WCW thing, that would that would have been Crockett all that period without Flair. That would have been a lot rougher row to hoe. But then again, you had Dusty, you had big names, so
Yeah, and that's just the thing. The wrestling is one of those things that the show must go on, and someone would have gotten plugged into those spots. Guys who already were champions, maybe
sure.
their runs would have been longer, whatever. But would anyone have been as iconic as Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan turned out to be? And I mean, it's hard to imagine that lightning striking a third, fourth, fifth time, and we'd have more of these ultra mega superstars.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, I can't help but notice that last week in the AWA episode, they told stories about airplanes. And then that thread continued to get pulled here in the Florida episode. So Eddie Graham, apparently really great guy in the community, did a lot with underprivileged kids and things like that. But he had a demon that he had tackled for 13 years. He
Yeah.
was sober for 13 years, but alcohol got back in his system, and he's somebody who didn't just drive drunk, he flew drunk and very drunk by the sounds of it.
Yeah, and the fact that as they said, great guy in the community, especially did a lot for youth in the community, right within his own family. What he did for Kern, kind of being his foster father for 7.5, 8 years during a pivotal time in his life. But then and just a self-made man. The 1961 Wrestler of the Year, a guy with a fifth grade education that went on to become a pilot and a boat captain. Ran this to the Briscoe said he ran the territory as tight and it just was a well-oiled machine. And then alcohol came back into his life, and you always hear people say, "Oh, they get drunk, or they succumb to their demons, they become a totally different person." He became I'm not just a different person, like the polar opposite. Like he just
Right.
was hell on wheels and a danger to himself and everyone around him.
Yeah, the story that they had a show in Melbourne, so they took the plane from Tampa to Melbourne, and then to go back, they, you know, Graham didn't go to the show in Melbourne. Instead, he got wasted with his girlfriend, and and so they go back to Tampa, and he doesn't call the tower in Melbourne to tell him he's taken off. They fly through the fireworks at Disney World, which is crazy to me that is something that could possibly be done.
And not just because, oh, we were flying and all of a sudden, oh, what unfortunate timing. Here come the fireworks. He saw the fireworks. He flew towards them and turned over his shoulder to Steve and was like, this is like your father and Nam, and dive bombed into him.
Yes. And then started flying to the music that was playing from the 8-track player. And then what's, it doesn't, the hits don't stop there. Then they have to land in Tampa. He again doesn't call the control tower, and he lands the plane on the same runway that a commercial airline is landing, coming the opposite directions, so they're like heading towards each other. And luckily, somebody spoke up, got Graham's attention, and he turns the plane off into the grass. And then they're surrounded by police, and he basically falls out of the plane door and starts, bumps on the ground and starts sort of selling. And he says, I was just in the ring. How'd I get here? I got hit in the head with by a chair by so and so, and they start taking care of him or whatever. But
and he's such a legend. The police who are there to swarm this freaking lunatic who has just landed without permission on a commercial runway, and then they realize it's Eddie Graham. They're like, "Oh, are you okay?"
yeah,
It's amazing the heroes that these some of these wrestlers were, and he absolutely was one to a lot of people, especially in that Florida territory.
yeah, yeah. Well, and they talked about legacy. If they struggled to bring it up on the show, and I can see why, because they all had sort of personal relationships with the Graham family.
Yeah,
But alcohol ultimately took Graham's life, in the sense that he committed suicide in 1985, and those problems seem to have sort of stemmed from a lot of things. Alcohol just being one of the things that was going on at the time.
that was the
Um,
gasoline on the fire. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, exactly. And then he was posthumously inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. His son Mike, who came up many times in the story here, his son Mike accepted on Eddie's behalf, but then Mike also committed suicide in 2010. So followed by Eddie's grandson.
my
So
grandson. Yeah,
so tragedy, really, when you look at how things ended. But what I thought was good is, they at the end of every episode they talk about legacy. And yes, you have the unfortunate circumstances that surround Eddie Graham's passing, but Briscoe basically said, all of us that kind of grew up through this Florida system, we spread out and we worked all over, and we kind of took everything that we did here and learned here, and we brought it to the other territory. So in that way, he kind of infected the the rest of the country with the flavor of Florida. And then to add to that, they talk about Steve Kern, the
yes.
alumni of Florida Championship Wrestling from Florida. Uh, he is tagged as the guy to run FCW, Florida Championship Wrestling, which is the precursor of NXT, and that was right here in Florida, and it's still right here in Florida. So,
Yeah.
so in a lot of ways, uh, they kind of were indicating those that were on the panel here that NXT is kind of the legacy of Championship Wrestling from Florida.
Yep. And I mean, geez, NXT is now making the future WWE stars, and it already has made a whole generation of them. And it all stems back to Steve Kern, and specifically that he wanted to keep it there in Florida, and it all goes back to that Florida territory, and that is not inconsequential.
And Eddie Graham being the guy who got Steve Kern in the business.
Indeed.
So great episode for me to watch, as I live down here in Florida now. I just moved down here a couple of years ago, and one of the things I do a lot is I attend Coastal Championship Wrestling shows down here, and they refer to themselves as the Last Territory. And they've recently, Gangrel is the head trainer and stuff, and Bill Alfonso is involved. Who, if you look really closely at some of those clips from last night, you can see Fonzie as a referee. But the larger point that I was making, Kevin Sullivan is involved with CCW now. I think that also CCW in some parts is part of the legacy of Championship Wrestling from Florida, especially when you look at how much territory CCW as a regional promotion down here covers, because Championship Wrestling from Florida, they talked about Tampa, they talked about Melbourne, but I know that they also did Miami. So they covered almost the entire state here. and that's what, CCW hasn't made it up to Tampa, but they've done Orlando all the way south and up to Nashville. So, and I know Ocala, which is even further north than Orlando. So I think the territory system, between NXT and CCW down here, I think that the legacy lives on quite well.
Absolutely. Most importantly, have you ever seen a CCW show, or have they ever run a CCW show in Yeehaw Junction?
We didn't talk about the Yeehaw Junction. I don't know where Yeehaw Junction is. I'm going to look that up real
Oh,
quick.
it's just up the road from Okeechobee.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
I swear to God, when they started telling that story, and the story is not, necessarily not something we have to go into, I assumed that was just a nickname, Yeehaw. And then, just for morbid curiosity's sake, I pulled up a map of Florida, and I found Yeehaw friggin' Junction. Gotta love the state of Florida.
Yes. Yeah, you're right. We don't need to. It was, all about ribs and pranks and stuff. And B. Brian Blair got his best there. As well, he mooned a restaurant. So in the end,
unintentionally.
And Gordon Soley on TV said the people of Yeehaw Junction would like to thank Brian for his public appearance.
Oh, good stuff.
Next week is going to be fun, John. They're doing Stampede Wrestling, and unlike the state of Florida, I've been all over here. I've never been to Calgary, so this should be fun. And of course they have Bret Hart on the panel, so I think it's kind of like if you didn't get one of them, you were. How could you really do the show if you didn't get one of them? Yeah. So they got Bret Hart, Abdullah the Butcher, David Schultz, and Bobby Bass. And I think all of those are people that Bret went into detail in his autobiography about. So David Schultz, what a legend of everything that happened with him in WWE and stuff. So it should be a fun panel.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was looking at Schultz last night, and I guess I must have turned for a second away from the television when they ran the Chiron with his name below his face. And I'm looking at him going like, I know him. I should know him. Why do I not know? So I rolled it back and I went like, oh, right, Dave Schultz. I'm like, oh, he's got to have some great stories. And how is it Abdullah the Butcher looks about 10 years younger than Bret Hart?
It's a miracle of modern whatever he's on.
I mean, he may be falling apart and whatnot, and he's got those gashes in his head that he can hide poker chips in, but like just looking at his face, he doesn't look as old as he is.
he actually looked good, and I think that he has new teeth or whatever too. I think, and I agree. Actually, I think everybody that we've seen on this show has looked pretty good for their age. You were just mentioning who in the panel was in their upper 70s.
Oh,
I don't know if it was this panel or if it was last week.
Last week they were, some of them were pretty aged.
Yeah,
Patera and
Patera was 78.
Yeah,
in last week's episode, but yeah, so everybody's kind of getting up in age when you talk about the territories, because the territories for the most part kind of were falling. The dying days were in the mid to late 80s. And so if you've got people that were veterans in those days, now, I mean, they're going to be up there.
They're 40 years on from wherever they were. That is, it's crazy to think about, and that that's all happened in my lifetime. It's very interesting, and like I said, every week you there's something to take away from it, and I love the fact that it's really helping me, because I as I said last week, I knew of the Minnesota territory, I knew of the Memphis territory, but now it's helping me put the names with the faces, the Gagnes and the Gordon Soley, that I knew was a legend, but I didn't know, Florida was kind of his original place, and I didn't necessarily know that. And of course, I knew the name Eddie Graham, and I didn't know that necessarily that Florida was his backyard. That was his place. So I love the education that I'm getting in terms of putting those faces on them, putting those faces that I knew, and now in my head I can put them on the map.
Yep. Yeah, and I like the idea of that. I'm sort of learning the legacy of the territories of each one from the people who were there. They're saying, this is where I think our territory had an impact on what you see today. I think that's cool. So
The other thing that I took away from last night was Gerald Briscoe. Always say, like, in my head, the minute I hear the Briscoe name, I think of Flair running down, the Briscoes and Harley Race, and
yeah,
and naming all. In my lifetime, I know him as kind of,
Stooge.
the Stooge. He was the goofy uncle, and now he's become kind of the goofy grandfather.
Right.
There was a shot of him last night at, like, I guess, a press conference, sitting down at a table, kind of with his arms folded in a collared shirt. Handsome young man that he was, but man, just look like I. When I think of him, I think of him with a big, goofy smile on his face
Yeah.
and doing something that's making me laugh. That young Gerald Briscoe is a man I would not F with. Like, just that. He looked like he would tear your goddamn head off.
Right. And
that's a perspective I just don't have on the Briscoes.
Yeah. And his brother Jack was the big singles guy.
Right.
So, all right, that said, I think so. Why don't we cut it off here, John? And I'll see you right back here next week. We'll talk about Calgary. So
Stampede, baby.